All right. And we're live. I already see first a couple of people putting in some comments in the chat and saying hello. Hi, everyone. Super happy to have you here. Gonna take the first couple of minutes walking you through some technicalities, and then I'll hand over to Bryan, who's the host of our final episode of Airtime Academy. So a couple of things. My name is Akash. I'm the CEO of Airtime, which is an autonomous product discovery platform turning customer calls into product insights. Today is the final session of our masterclass series called Research for Product Managers. And all those who couldn't join previous sessions, we covered essential user research skills to understand who your customer is, choose the right problems to focus on. And the third module was about validating solutions. We have recordings for all of them, so you can go back to them. Our host is Dr. Bryan Rill, who has over 20 years of research experience. He's the founder of Real Insights, a boutique user research agency, and he also teaches at UC San Diego some of the topics that he's teaching us today here as well. And without further ado, Bryan, let me hand over the mic to you, and let's focus on our topic today, continuous discovery.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, let's bring up the slides. There we go. Perfect. Well, welcome everyone to the fourth and final module of this very short series. I hope it's been valuable to you so far. It's been an interesting challenge for me trying to condense all this knowledge down into a set of learnings that are really valuable to product managers. And this is part of actually a larger masterclass in design research. So kind of at the end of today's talk, I'm going to ask you if you're interested or know other people that would be interested in a longer masterclass with more hands-on help, just to let us know in the comments, and we'll keep track of that. And then once it's ready, we'll let you know. Okay, so jumping into the subject, today is the subject is continuous discovery. And this is a buzzword that I hear a lot, at least. And it's one that I kind of like because it implies a particular mindset on a product team. And that's a mindset of constant growth and learning, right? It's saying, hey, we're not just going to take on research and customer feedback in these project-based mindset where it's like, oh, we're going to gather some information and that's going to inform our roadmap for the next 2 years, and then we'll do some more research at that point and so on. Instead, what continuous discovery is really a method that organizations can use to keep a finger on the pulse of the customer experience at all times, right? And what we do with that is we use that to drive the decisions that we're making. So I personally see continuous discovery as part of a larger effort called CX, right? And there's a difference in UX and CX that I'll show in a moment, okay? And today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on systems design, right? So rather than talking so much about what's the day-to-day process of continuous discovery and how you have conversations in your team. And by the way, if you're interested in that, Teresa Torres' book, Continuous Discovery Habits, is a great resource there. What I want to do is think about how do we put the systems into place that make this whole thing work? Because it's not quite as simple as it seems on the surface. Okay, so here's the outline for today, right? We're going to go through looking at what is a unified view of a customer. We're going to talk about strategic development, how you take action on feedback, and finally, one of the biggest questions product managers ask, how in the world do I find people to talk to? Okay, so let's begin by looking at some of the real reasons why continuous discovery is an important thing, right? And you can see here, it brings you a lot of value as an organization. But I also want to emphasize that it's a commitment, right? And that commitment is to being customer-centric, which is not just, lip service, right? And it's not just a survey from time to time with your customer base. It's actually a commitment to saying we're going to dedicate time and resources to really engaging our customers on a regular basis, making them feel special, making them feel rewarded for giving us their valuable time and feedback, and then using that information to actually drive decisions from the customer up. Now, obviously, leadership and sales and marketing have a voice at that table. But in my mind, continuous discovery brings balance to that conversation, right? And it really helps make sure that the product is delivering to the needs of the people that are using it. So I said I'd talk about CX and UX, and here's a nice visual that I found a while back that I really like. Okay. And what you see here is that CX focuses really on the customer's journey and their perceptions all the way from initial brand awareness to fulfillment, right? How they use the product, how they interact with the entire organization. Okay. Where UX focus is more specifically on the user experience of the product or service, right? And we're looking at meeting really clear metrics like the ISO 9241 usability standards, which is measured by effectiveness, which is the ability to complete core tasks, efficiency, smooth and fast flows, and satisfaction. Now, UX and CX research share very similar methods, right? Interviews and surveys are big tools, but they do require a little bit unique approaches. However, when the insights are combined from these, they lead to really measurable improvements in conversion, retention, adoption, and brand loyalty, all things that matter to the business. So this is what a unified view of the customer looks like from a systems perspective, right? So the idea here is that we are triangulating data from a bunch of different potential inputs that we have as an organization. And I think there's more data available to most organizations than they may realize, right? And if you look at this list on the left, right, you've got calls made by every customer-facing team. So support, sales, customer success, right? You have interviews that product managers are doing. You have other research efforts that either the product or the research team is doing. You can have in-product feedback tied to specific functionality. And by the way, today we're going to talk about how to use Airtime to do that. Okay. You can gather other customer feedback through lots of different means. There's product analytics, which is looking at the behavior of using the product. And then, of course, you have data about the market, things like competitive intelligence. Okay. All of these tell you things about your existing and potential customers. And so the more you can synthesize them, the better. But the problem is that with a lot of organizations, this data gets siloed very, very easily. And the challenge then becomes, how do you orchestrate all this information so that it actually goes to the decision makers, right? And if you look at the benefit side of this slide, right, it's very clear, both from in terms of, how the team feels that they understand their customer, to being able to design to that target, and also being able to measure the impact of good product decisions and good business decisions, right? It's really easy to see where a unified view of the customer adds value to the organization. Now, for me, when I think about building a system of continuous discovery and this unified view, I like to start with a customer journey map, right? That highlights key touch points in the customer lifecycle. So often it begins like the one here with sales and customer success teams. And you can see here that these are, 4 phases of the overall customer lifecycle, right? Onboarding, service, expansion, and renewal. You might have different names for these things, but this is the whole, scope of a customer engagement, right? And there are a bunch of different key touch points that you've identified here. Now, continuous discovery research can then unpack each of these stages in much more detail. You gain fidelity over time by asking people about their experiences at specific moments that matter, okay, which can be done by collecting data from as many of the inputs as possible that I showed you on the last slide. Okay, so you can see here I kind of have a step through, right? First is figure out these touch points in the journey. Next, you got to ask, what do I want to know? Am I gathering quantitative data through metrics? Am I asking qualitative feedback? What type of questions am I asking? Okay. And then once you have that, you can then set up things like your listening posts, which are places where you listen, right, to your customer's experience. And most often these are surveys, but it includes a lot of other types of information as well. And that brings us to our first exercise of today. Okay. So just take out a piece of paper or type on your computer and jot down to yourself the answers to some of these questions. Okay. And the questions are, what are the top 3 moments that matter to you? Now, I know we have people that sit on different teams in the audience today. So I would expect to see that maybe a product team person has a different set of moments that matter than someone that might be on the customer success team or the CX team or the research team, right? And this is an interesting discussion to have in an organization, because if you ask each person what their top 3 moments are and then compare notes, you'll see this difference. And you can only collect information at so many places, right? Because if you just go out and you say, all right, there's 15 moments that matter to us as a business, and then you survey people at all 15 of those moments, you're going to realize that you stop getting feedback like instantly. And you want to know why? Because you bug people, right? Would you like it if every month or every week you got asked another piece of feedback from the same software platform? Most people don't like that. Okay. So you really have to think about the top 3 moments, right? That you can consistently collect feedback from people and it won't bother them. It won't interrupt them too much. And those moments can change from quarter to quarter or year to year, but that's a strategic and internal discussion to have. Okay. Once you have figured out those moments, the next question, of course, is how are you collecting data? Maybe a moment isn't something that you would want to use a survey for. Maybe a moment is behavioral product analytics, right? I just released a new feature. Are people using it? I have this new flow. Where are the drop-offs happening in this flow? I don't need to survey people to find out that information. All I have to do is look at what's happening with my product on the back end. Now, if I want to know why these things are happening, then I need to talk to my customers. But I can see the pattern with analytics that might lead to a further inquiry. Okay. So what that means is that you can have more than 3 survey moments, right? You can have multiple moments that matter, but have some ways of gathering data around them that are customer facing and other ways that are more internal. And then finally, how are you acting on what you learn? What happens to that information? Who's responsible for it? How do they share that with you, or how do you share that with other people? What happens after that? Right? Try to think through a little bit about your internal workflows and sketch that out, because we're going to come back to that topic later today. Now, if you can't answer all of these questions, then you have a blind spot. And it's a gap that if you fill it with the right information, could be doing a lot for your organization. So if you feel that there's a gap, maybe try to jot down what you think that gap is right now. All right, Akos, do you have any stories about working with customers with Airtime where you kind of had a conversation like this and used Airtime to fill one of those gaps or collect data at one of those key moments?
So one of the, or maybe I can share a personal story on how we, like what kind of moments that matter we have at Airtime. So one of the things is when somebody creates an account, you can do a few things. And what I'm primarily interested in is if somebody signs in, do they try the video analysis? Because it's one of the features that I believe has a very low time to value. It's very easy to try it. And if I see that someone logged in, I see it from analytics, and they didn't try it, then there's a high probability that that person will not come back. So one of the pivotal moments in the user journey is to understand and get whoever signs up, move on to the next step and upload their first videos. And I'm primarily using analytics for that to understand the flow, where they click, how they move about in the application, and that from which page do they exit. I think that's one of the most insightful things.
And what you can do with Airtime, and I'll speak to this later with some examples, is if you find that there's a particular interaction that you want to know more about, you can target one of the microsurveys to show up at specifically that moment, right? So if someone does or doesn't do something, you can use that as a trigger to pop up a microsurvey and just be like, hey, we saw that, you visited our video analysis page. What do you think? Right? Why have you used it or why have you not used it? Right? And that starts to gather really, really valuable feedback automatically, which is what really is nice about it. Okay, so let's move on and talk about some of these listening posts, right? Now I have here, there's a lot of different listening posts, but when you think about like the customer facing ones, their experience of receiving things from you where they know it's you, right? There's 3 broad categories, right? One is passive feedback, right? And this is reactive feedback. In other words, this is a button somewhere on your page. Maybe it's in the header, maybe it's in the footer, maybe it's in the help menu. It's really up to you where you put it, where a customer has to initiate giving a feedback. Okay. Now the burden is on the customer to discover this feedback rating mechanism. So a lot of times findability is a problem with these. Also, another factor with passive feedback is that most of the time people only click on that button when they have a problem. So if you're using that for your CSAT, for example, it's going to negatively bias your CSAT scores because they're getting in touch with you because they're unhappy about something, or something has gone wrong, or they can't figure something out. Okay. So what we need to do is we have to balance that out. And that's where things like intercepts and targeted surveys help. An intercept is what we were just talking about with Airtime, where it is in their product experience. It is proactive feedback in the sense that it pops up based upon a set of criteria that you create, right? And it can happen at any moment. So people are happy, sad, they're in any state of mind. So if you're using something like this for your CSAT or your CES, right, then you're still getting transactional feedback, but it's much more balanced in terms of the type of feedback that you're going to get. And if you study this over time, you'll see that you have kind of a much more representative sample of sentiment with an intercept. Also, you can pick when and how that intercept shows up. So you have a lot of control over that one. And then finally, we have things like targeted surveys, right? Which usually these are a bit longer, right? This is the 10 to 15 question survey. At most, I recommend no more than 10. And you can distribute this in a few ways, right? So you could have it pop up in your helper with a link to an external survey platform. You could use something like email distribution. You could even have it show up as an intercept, although that's a little tricky. Typically, as you can see here on this slide, there's a gateway. So it might be something like there's a small intercept that pops up and says, hey, do you have 5 minutes to share your feedback about the product with us? If so, click here. And then when you click, it does one of two things. It either opens up another tab in their browser and it takes them to the survey site, or it opens up the survey right inside their experience. And you can have a longer survey there as well. These I really only recommend doing a couple times a year with most products, simply because it's a big set of questions, right? But this is also where you can dig into really specific questions or drivers of particular ratings and things like that. There's a lot that you can do with targeted surveys. Now, I wish I could tell you that just having surveys was enough. But the thing is that once you have these listening posts set up, the next step is you got to think about, well, how am I going to direct the flow of information? Right? Like an air traffic controller, data flow should ideally automate the movement of data to those who consume it. And unfortunately, this is one place where things fall short. So what I'm showing you right now is a diagram, a data flow diagram that I put together for a client a couple years ago. And we set up listening posts at different places in the consumer experience. We also had email distribution. At the time we were using, that client is using the tool Sprig. And you can see here that then you have all of your phase one, which is collecting your inputs. And you can see here there's a long list. So you've got the NPS survey, you have in-app microsurveys, you have product manager design surveys, you have the passive feedback, which is always on. There were gong videos from sales calls. There's discovery calls from people on different teams. And then there's sales and support feedback. And what this team did was they used Product Board for their product management tool. And Product Board has a Chrome extension that anybody can put in their Chrome browser. So basically, if I'm a sales rep and I'm on a call with someone and they say something interesting, I can open up that little Chrome extension, type in my notes, and send it directly to Product Board, which then goes to an inbox, and someone on the team has to, attach that piece of feedback to the right feature being developed. Okay. And that's really helpful for teams that aren't going to necessarily be using the research software themselves to direct feedback to the people that need it, right? And then the next step is, well, what am I going to do with all that information, right? I have like 7 or 8 different inputs now. What do I do, right? So this is where things like dashboards are helpful and customer databases. And this can be set up a lot of different ways. But the idea is you want to maybe bring together some kind of a scorecard, which is something I'll show you a little bit later, that summarizes the high-level metrics and divides up the feedback into meaningful categories. Okay, then there's the question of, well, what happens to that information, right? How does it actually, is the product team going to consume the information in the research analysis tool? Maybe, maybe not. Okay, and so I like to think about, where does the product team live, right? And in this case, the team is using a combination of Dovetail and Product Board. Right? Dovetail was the research repository. Product Board was the place where all decisions were made. And so what our goal was in this data map was to basically make it so that all the insights from whatever system they came from ended up linked to or inserted inside Product Board related to the feature that was being worked on. So that if I'm the product manager, I can just go into my particular place of ownership, right? And everything's being delivered to me. either automatically or it's being pushed there with things like hyperlinks by other members of the team that are responsible for analysis and insight management. Okay. And then the final piece of this, right, is, well, how does this link to our CRM? Right. So the database of the customers, it might be Salesforce, it might be Snowflake, it might be Domo, it might be a different system, right? And that system is very important because there's other teams that might want to also access this information, like customer success, for example, right? If they're trying to make sure that people stick around and continue to expand their product usage, they really need to know what kind of feedback those people are giving. And all of this can be done, but it's not easy, right? This takes a lot of thinking. So I've been in not just one conversation where people go, oh, it's so easy to set this up, right? Let's just go ahead and buy this tool because it looks super awesome. and we've got continuous discovery going. But the thing is no, it's not. It's not as easy, right? And here are some of the common mistakes, okay, that I've seen people make. You know, different teams have different goals, right? They have their own strategies, so they're not aligning. You have information silos, right? People decide to get a tool because it's really great for their team and they don't think about how it needs to integrate with other tools, like in that diagram I just showed you, right? And then it makes it very difficult sometimes to actually get data to move from one place to another. And then finally, a lack of incentivization. If you want the sales and support team to share their notes, they need some incentive to do that little bit of extra work. And a lot of companies don't do that. And so that leads to blind spots. It leads to redundant work. And the way that we fix this is to have a strategy. And now I do want to point out here that the bigger your team is, the harder it can be to get everyone together and share what they know. And yet this is essential. It's really up to the leadership of your organization to understand that there's a paradox here. And that paradox is that the more people you have, the less holistic understanding you might have. And so they need to make sure that they're creating the space and the time for different teams to meet and share what they know. Now, from what I've seen, leaders might be blind to this, and it's not intentional neglect, okay? It's just that they don't know what they don't know, right? And often it's up to a member of the team to kind of be a champion and take the initiative and start reaching out to their peers. And kind of like a grassroots campaign, it is possible to drive change from the single person struggling to gather feedback to the wider organization. So that leads us to exercise number 2. Okay, so answer a few questions for yourself, right? And the first of them is, what do you not know about your customers that you wish you did? Now, every product manager I have ever met has a list of these. So just write down at least one of them. What's the burning question for you? Okay, then think about where in your organization might someone or some system be collecting some of this data. Depending on the size of your company, the chances are there's data being collected that's just sitting there. And you got to kind of go on a little bit of a treasure hunt to find that data and figure out how to make sense of it, but it's there. And then if you can figure out the system or the place, then the next question is who's in charge, right? Who's your point of contact in that area? And once you figure that out, message that person and have a meeting with them. Go to lunch. Build a relationship. Learn what they're doing, why they're doing it. And also, maybe there's other information they're capturing that you hadn't thought of that might be interesting to you. Okay. A good relationship is two-way. So ask them how you might help them in return for them giving some of their time and information to you. And if you can find that win-win between the two of you, then it's time to start collaborating. A great example of this from my own experience was I worked in an enterprise company that bought a data analytics platform, and they had their own team. And I was, a senior CX researcher, and the data analytics team was doing their thing. And we were both presenting reports every month of what we found. And we weren't talking to each other at first, right? And then we sat in on each other's presentation once and we're like, oh my God, there's so much here that builds off of each other, right? Because I was looking at all the qualitative, subjective feedback and the ratings through listening posts, and he was looking at what was going on underneath the hood. And we started meeting and actually planning our presentations together to tell a combined story of both the analytics and the feedback. And it was much more impactful. But we had to reach out to each other to start it. Our organization did not realize this and say, hey, you guys need to do a combined report. We were the ones that did that, right? And then the organization benefited from that and made that a policy. So I'll give you a couple of minutes just to think through this. Akash, if you have anything you want to share, please do so.
An interesting phenomenon I came across with some of our clients when they came to us was a moment when there was like a new head of product, or even new marketing person coming on board who wasn't deeply acquainted with the customers and who asked the exact same question, or even the step before, what do we know about the customers? And then everything that they knew is typically, in most companies, it's scattered somewhere in different, in like heads in the back of people's minds, in some document, be it Notion, Dovetail, and other tools. And it's sort of something that I marked for myself, that whenever like a new product person comes on board, be it a product leader or on the operational side, that's also a moment when people want to get like really deep and have an in-depth understanding of what a customer do. But this sort of sentiment, it subsides a bit over time. You settle in with your role, and you develop a comfort that you're more acquainted with your customers. And maybe that's a false comfort. I don't know if you have some experience or stories on that.
I mean, in my experience, when we're looking specifically at the product team, or actually really any customer facing team, there's a real clear desire to understand the customer, because that reduces the amount of guessing you have to do. So there's a desire there, but there's also a bit of a reluctance to do the work of what it takes, because either maybe someone's just not familiar with what they need to do, or they're not familiar with where the stuff is in an organization and nobody's telling them, right? Or like you said, they've kind of just settled into their role and they don't feel that they need to continue doing that. That people stay the same, which they don't. And then I think finally, it's just that once you get into your job, all your time is committed to your day-to-day responsibilities, and it becomes something extra that you have to do to go find this information. And that always ends up getting the can that gets kicked down the road. Right. And that to me is a huge problem. And we're going to talk in a minute about strategy, because strategy is one way of making sure that members of your team have that time, right, and have the permissions and the resources necessary to go out and do that. So that's a great segue into creating a voice of the customer strategy. And while one person can be the impetus for creating a culture of continuous discovery, it's a lot better if the organization has a plan. Right. And I call this the voice of the customer strategy because the title of it clearly states the goal, right? We are trying to capture the voice of the customers, and we're asking questions like, what's the experience that we want to provide to them? And who's accountable for each touch point along the way? And it's really easy to paint a pretty picture. Oh, we're going to have the best customer experience ever. Our customer is so happy and joyful, and our product is so smooth. If I see anything like that in the company, I know that they've got their blinders on and they're completely unrealistic, right? Because one, that's an unrealistic goal. And two, that tells me that the vast majority of the time when you see a statement like that, that means that there's confirmation bias. They're only going to pay attention to the data that supports a pre-existing idea of their product experience. I like to meet people who are humble, or at least realistic, about the customer experience. And when I meet those people, usually they say, well, we have certain confidence, right? Obviously, we have a product that's working in the world, that's great. But they're aware of that they have blind spots, even if they don't know quite how to fill them. And that's where we do a lot of work with organizations. Myself and my team is we come in and we help them figure that out. Okay, so I've got a 4-step process for you. And anybody here that's on a CX team, I'm just going to apologize ahead of time because I'm really simplifying something that takes a lot more work than I can put into a presentation. But I'm going to do my best to reduce the entire complexity of a process that can take months or even years into 4 slides. All right. So step 1 is align, right? What are you measuring and who owns these things, right? So this is one example of a CX value pyramid, not period, that divides up metrics by kind of like these categories, right? So at the base of the pyramid, you have behavioral metrics, property metrics, and this is where your product analytics can give you this information. So that's the system to gather this data, and you got to figure out who's going to do it. It needs to be someone that's good at data analysis. I can tell you that. A lot of times BAs get this job, or product managers. But you've got to have a mind for it, right? And that's a different mind than the next layer up, right? Which is transactional metrics. And this is, a lot of what CX is, right? So the CSAT, customer satisfaction, customer effort scores. other feedback metrics, right? And these focus on specific transactions in the user experience. And this is really what the product team, in my opinion, owns. Even if they're not collecting the data, they own the actions on that data because it's all about the product experience. Okay. And then finally, we have relational at the top of the pyramid. And this is usually measured by things like NPS or attributed revenue. And often this is owned by a different team. Maybe customer success is most frequent. Maybe someone else like the CXO in an organization owns this metric because it's a much broader paintbrush, right? We're talking CX here. So it's not just the product experience, it's the overall relationship someone has with the company, right? So the product team is not the right owner of that one, right? Because it's not their purview, right? It needs to be someone that's looking more holistically about the customer experience that owns a relational metric. Okay, so you can divide this up, but the important thing is that you determine what is the metric that matters. What is the North Star in each of these categories? And why is it the North Star? Don't pick a North Star just because every other company's doing it. Don't jump on the NPS bandwagon just because they're like, oh, NPS is the metric for relationships. Is it? There's some pretty strong challenges going on right now to NPS as a metric in general. I still believe in it, but it's limited in some aspects. We can talk about that more off on the side, right? So really think clearly about what you want to measure and how you're going to gather it. That's step one. Okay. Step two is then designing the workflows that go along with this. And to me, really, there's two major objectives here. One is making sure that we're gathering feedback and we're directing that to the product team for review and taking action. Now, I'm speaking strictly from the perspective of product research right now. Obviously, there's other teams that want to consume the information, but I'm trying to build a workflow for product managers, right? And then also the second step is closing the loop. Now, this is where a lot of product teams don't do it at all, right? They collect feedback, they read it, they take action on it, and that's it, right? And that's a huge missed opportunity. Because if you communicate back to people that gave you feedback, the impact of their feedback, one, they're going to be more willing to give you more feedback in the future. Two, they're going to be happier customers because they feel like something happened, right? And that's going to really do a lot for building this customer-centric culture. So those are the goals, right? And then the requirements is thinking through what are all the things that we have to put in place, okay? Now this, you can read the list here, but this is often the most complex step. And it really is dependent upon things like how your organization is structured, what your priorities are, who are the people involved in all of this, what are your processes? And those vary from organization to organization. So I wish I could tell you there is one simple system that I could help you implement, but there's not, right? If we have time today, I will illustrate a couple examples, one from a startup and one from a growing enterprise SaaS company that will give you some illustrations of this. But it really is, I think, very much a bespoke process to get this right. And here's an example. This is an example of a workflow diagram that I created for an enterprise SaaS company. Now, in this model, the support and the CX teams were responsible for collecting and analyzing feedback. And then they delivered actionable feedback, not all feedback, just the stuff that's actionable, to the product and the development teams to review and act upon. Now, this process and this diagram is supported by a dedicated experience or XM management tool that collects feedback and automates action with an internal ticketing system. So, for example, the XM tool was Qualtrics in this case. And then the company had an internal ITSM, so an internal ticketing system. And we set up automations so that if someone responded to a survey and they gave a low rating, it would automatically create a ticket that then went to and was directed to the support and CX teams. And they had to review and interpret that feedback, decide if it was actionable or not. And if it was, they would push that to the product team who would then review that feedback. And usually it was organized by product areas. So if a piece of feedback came in and it was related, let's say, to the messaging system, right? I would direct, and this was me in this case, I would direct that feedback to that specific product manager, right? And often what I would do was, even though we had an ITSM system, I would take the ticket number and I would send it to them in Slack and be like, hey, here's something that I need you to look at and tell me how to respond to this customer. Is this something that, we can fix right now? Is this something that I can direct them to some product documentation? Is this something that we're working on? Is this something we're not going to do? Right. And I would get that feedback. And then I would respond back to the customer directly by email. And I would say, hey, thank you for your feedback. Here's the question. I talked to my product team. Here's the answer. So this is a great example of a product team working in collaboration with a CX researcher, which is my role at the time, right? I was in charge of managing this entire system that I'm showing you. And then I would just reach out to the PMs, get their feedback, and then act on it. And over time, I learned a lot of kind of standard answers to a variety of different questions. I created a document with boilerplate answers. So if someone asked this, then this was the answer. And I had this really great database of questions and answers, and I could really quickly respond to people without having to bug the PMs too much. It was only when something happened that I just didn't know the answer to, or if there was a bug or a problem with the product, I would direct that to the PM immediately. The other thing that I did was every month, I would summarize feedback in reports and scorecards, and I would send that out to the teams. And I'll show you those in just a minute. Okay, so now you got your system in place. Well, that's great. What are you going to do next? Well, you got to think about how you're going to communicate cross-functionally within your organization, because CX systems are beautiful things when they're working right, but they fall apart when people don't manage them correctly. So before you get wooed by that latest CX platform and all of its capacities, make sure that you're internally aligning on who's going to do what, how they will be held accountable, and what resources they're being given to do the job you're asking of them. It also helps to have the development team on board, because the implementation of many survey tools requires their efforts. And actually, a little plug to Airtime. Airtime is the first survey tool that does in-app intercepts that I've ever used where I did not have to rely upon multiple sprints from the dev team to put it in place. In fact, I did it myself with Google Tag Manager. And that's a small miracle because I'm not an engineer, okay? But I was still able to figure it out in a pretty short amount of time. And that's amazing, right? Because this is one of those things that hangs up the implementation of a lot of systems. Let's say that you're using a tool that's integrated with your CRM. Someone has to set that integration up so that the records, the fields are pushing back and forth between your survey tool and that CRM. Okay, that takes time. Let's say you have a complex product, right? You have to get your engineers to insert the code for your survey tool so that the intercepts pop up in all the different places in which you want it to behave. And usually that's the sandbox environment first. So you test it and make sure it works the way you want, and then you push it to production after that. That requires 2 setups, not just one. So having conversations ahead of time about who's going to do what really helps that when you go ahead and you get the subscription to that tool, you can implement it as fast as possible. And finally, step 4, okay, the insights to action plan. Now, the final step is really how you're going to decide what are you going to do with this information, how are you going to present the insights, and how are you going to act upon it. Now, I'm still waiting on a solution that can automate the tracking and impact of insights. And until then, I've developed workarounds with different systems for different clients. So sometimes if you have a tool like Dovetail and you're putting all your information in there, you can build out follow-up and engagement fields as custom fields. You could create custom databases in tools like Google Sheets or Airtable, or you can use Jira or another project management tool as some kind of a ticketing system. But the thing is that none of these are ideal, okay? You're going to have to do some manual follow-up. I was actually asking the research ops community about this issue quite specifically recently, and I was trying to see what other people were doing and if there was a way of actually fully automating it, and the answer is no, okay? At some point, whoever is trying to track the impact of the insights being generated has to go around and talk to other people, mainly product managers, and say, hey, we delivered this report last month, right? Here were the top insights and the feedback we got from customers. Has anything been done on these, right? And then you get some information. Great. Has that been pushed into the product? And then you have to go talk to someone else. Has that made a difference? Has that moved any of our needles, right? Is it making a difference to the business in terms of revenue? Is it making a difference in terms of one of those metrics that we're evaluating, right? And often you have to go talk to someone else. So just to find out the impact of a single insight, it's almost like an investigation where you have to talk to different people on different teams to weave together that story. And I know a lot of people that work in research that struggle with this on a regular basis, right? And it's just like, oh my God, I wish this were easier. And eventually I'm sure a tool will come out that helps with this, but no matter what the tool is, the point is that someone has to manage that tool. If you don't have someone at the helm, you know, tracking what happens. So it's not just about delivering the insights, right? That in some ways that might be the easy part. It's figuring out what happens to them and pushing change based upon them, and that requires someone owning it. Okay. Now, of course, you can't do everything all at once, right? So I like to start with any client I work with and say, you know, what's the minimum amount that we can do right now in terms of reporting? And then also ask, well, where do we want to go? What are our long-term goals, right? And then you set up what you can do right now and you create a roadmap for your CX to get to that destination, okay? Now, the other piece of this is the follow-up. And there's two types, right? There's internal follow-up, right? Which is converting those insights to action. And then there's external follow-up, which is communicating the impact back to your customers. And the terms I learned for these are internal and external closing of the loop, right? So you can use those or any other terms that you like. And I'm going to give you a few examples of what reporting looks like, kind of at different scales. All right. So this is one method that I have found to be incredibly useful, and I call it the CX scorecard, right? Which is essentially a combination of quantitative experience metrics, right? Like CSAT, CS, or NPS, and then qualitative summaries that break it down into three buckets. What's working well, right? So improved or delightful experiences, areas for improvement, which can be expressed as frustrations or confusions, and requests. Because when you're talking about continuous discovery, almost all feedback falls into one of those three buckets. Okay. And you can present scorecards like this in a single slide. That's what this image is. It's a one pager, or you can expand it, right? So there's a lot of things that you could add to this. So you could add high level metrics. You could add graphs of change in those metrics over time and other information. So instead of a slide, it could be like a one pager, which gives you more space to work with. Okay. And then you can also tie these things to dashboards and reports and other things like that. And again, it depends on your organization, which one you choose. Okay. Here it is an example of a dashboard. Now, a lot of survey tools these days include dashboards with customizable widgets. So Qualtrics, Sprig, things like that. You can build your own dashboards, but you don't necessarily have to have those tools. This is free, right? This is Google's data platform, right? And I used a basic tool like Typeform, and I use Google's data to create a dashboard for one of our clients. And you can see here that up at the top of the dashboard, we had a set of filters that we could use to look at the data in different ways. Okay. And then we had the number of responses we got over a period of time and what ratings were for different aspects of the customer experience, right? So in this case, it was a physical wellness product that people used in their home, and then it had a digital app, right, to complement that. And so we looked at everything from the advertising and packaging of the product to the purchasing experience, to the actual use of the physical product, and then also to the use and experience of the digital app, right? So that was a bunch of different key touch points or moments that mattered for this organization. And what we did was we put together a rating, right? At each of those points, you can see the first question is below, and the dashboard was much longer than this. But the first question was, did our advertising effectively communicate what Vessel does, right? Rated on a 1 to 10 scale. And we had similar questions along the way. So this was really, really useful, right? And then what we did was we combined this with some follow-up interviews where we invited people that took the survey to a call to explain their answers and to tell us more. These were usually 20 to 30-minute calls where we would essentially pull up their survey answer and we would dig into it with them. And the whole thing was orchestrated with Klaviyo, which is like an email or messaging campaign management system where you can create marketing or communication campaigns based around a bunch of different criteria. So in this case, we had one that invited people to give feedback on their product experience 2 weeks after they signed up for an account. Okay. 90 days after that, we invited them to share their experience in an interview because now they had some time with the product, right? They got over that initial honeymoon period, right? And if they were still using the product 90 days later, that means that it has persistent value for them. And it also means they have enough experience with the product that they can give us much more mature feedback than if we asked them a bunch of questions in the first week or two, right? So what we would do is we would set up essentially these invites. And in this case, they were all sent out by email, which in my opinion is not the best system, but that's what we were working with at the time. And we got a percentage back. So we might send out a couple hundred invites every month, and we would get about 20 interviews and about 30 or 40 survey answers. That's plenty of information to make product decisions from, guys. It's about just setting up your funnels right. And then the final example is this is when I was working at ServiceNow, and this is an example of a internal web page that we built where we essentially had a home base for everything CX, right? So in this page, someone could come visit the page. They could have an understanding of all the different channels that we're using. They could take a look at our survey forms and the questions we're asking. There was a link directly to the dashboards that we were using. And there was also links to all of the reports throughout time. So we essentially tried to make it as easy as possible to communicate what we were learning to the organization. So literally every month when I would give a CX report, I would pull up this dashboard and I would invite people to go visit it and engage in that information, right? And then they could follow up and ask me questions afterwards. So having a public home is really, it's kind of like a repository. You can do it in a dedicated repository tool, or you can kind of build your own with any site builder, right? There's a bunch of different ways to do it. The point is that having a home is kind of like having a bulletin board in the hallway in an office, right? Where it's like, okay, everybody's going to walk by this, or at least you're going to point it out to people as much as possible. And that really increases the chances of people consuming the information that you work so hard to gather. Because if you just put it in Slack threads, that's great for a moment, but it gets buried very, very quickly, right? So what is your source of truth is an important question to ask, and then drive people to that source of truth regularly. Phew. Like I said, CX strategy in 4 slides. I know I skipped over a bunch of stuff, but to me, that's the core, right? And any one of those steps can be unpacked into a whole bunch of sub things. We're willing to help you with that, but those are the big pieces I think that are needed, not just for CX, but in particular for continuous discovery. And that brings us to our third and final exercise, right? So a few questions again for you. The first is, what's your North Star metric? Now, if you don't know what a North Star is like the top KPI, right, for different teams. So I want you to ask, what's the North Star specifically for the product team? Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be a metric like CSAT or CES. North Star could be something like number of logins in a month. It could be number of different features activated in the product. It could be number of, or how session length over time, right? It really just depends on what do you think delivers value to your organization and something you can measure, which is the second question, right? How do you actually measure it? And then the third question is, what is your action to insights process right now? What happens when you gather this information? Now, research is kind of funny in that it's really, really super valuable, but it has no value if it's not acted on. And so what happens if you don't act on your research is you end up back in a non-customer centric culture where decisions are often made from the top down with no explanation why or evidence to support it. Or worse, someone is cherry picking from customer feedback and making decisions based upon an unrepresentative sample. And I'm going to speak to this one for a minute because I deal with this all the time and it drives me nuts, right? Like, you'll find someone in a company that's super enthusiastic about feedback, and they'll pay for the effort to go get it, right? And then they'll sit down and they'll look at feedback and they'll read like one interview transcript and they'll go, "Oh, look, this is what I was saying." That's confirmation bias, okay? Or they look and they go, "Oh man, this is our most important customer and they want this. Let's build that." And it's like the decision makes every one of the other customers mad. Right. And so this cherry picking to me is really bad research. I always like to have descriptive statistics, around my insights. So, okay, here's a problem someone said, or a feature request someone made. How many people asked for that? How many people said that? How many people is enough to justify the work that it's going to take to actually do something about it? Right. Those are the important conversations to have. And you can't do that if you're cherry picking. Okay. And then, of course, there's the third scenario, which is that sales requests end up driving the entire roadmap. Now, none of these are good for the product team because what happens is you lose your voice in the decision making. Your seat at the table is vacated if you don't have anything to back up your ideas. And I'm pretty sure every product manager that's on this call has experienced this directly. So how do you get past that? Well, have a plan. Have a metric. Go gather information. Bring that evidence into the discussions. You may not win, but at least you're coming to the table with really good data to say, here's why we should be product led. Here's why product deserves a voice in terms of where we're going. Okay. And like I said, I don't know what's going to happen after that because every organization is different, but that gives you your best chance of having an impact on the product direction. So I'm mindful of time. So I'm going to move on to the last little section for today, which is trying to conquer one of the biggest problems, which is finding people to talk to. You can have the best system in the world, but if you don't have a panel, it's going to be really hard to get it to work, right? And so I call this a customer advisory board, and it's essentially a group of people who've agreed to be part of ongoing product research. Healthy cabs are really fundamentally important, and I think we've talked about all the reasons why. And I think that really building one comes down to 3 very simple points. 1 is always be grateful to people that give you feedback. 2, incentivize their efforts. I'll speak more to that in a minute. And 3, acknowledge how they impacted the product. If you do those 3 basic things, you'll have a healthy and successful cab. But how do you build one in the first place, right? So here's my methodology for internal panels, okay? And my methodology is simple. It's all hands on deck. Anybody that is a customer-facing person or team, when they talk to customers, they should be asking them, hey, are you willing to give us more feedback? Okay. Make this a cultural practice across the organization, and then make it very easy for people to say yes. Okay. And the way that you can do that is simple. You can have a question at the end of your surveys, like the one I have here. If it's a conversation on the phone or something like that, you can send them an email with a link to a sign-up form. Okay. And that will take them to a place that gives informed consent. Here's what it means to be a member of a panel. Here's what we expect from you. Here's what we're going to give you in return. Here's how we're going to protect your information and your privacy. Okay. Do you agree? If they say yes, great. Now they're a member of the cab. You immediately start building the relationship from there. And if you tie these forms to a database, you can actually automate the process of cab signups. But that whole automation won't work unless you're having those conversations and you're inviting people up front. The survey question will get you a small number of people signing up for the cab, but what really builds a cab is person-to-person invitations. Okay, there is no system that can replace the quality of a human relationship. So use those relationships to build your panels. And if you don't have a good internal panel, you can build external panels as well. This is very time intensive. I have done a lot of work for startups where they didn't want to put any money into paid respondent panels. And so we put a ton of hours into recruitment through social media, forming online groups, screening people. And I started to do the math on this. And what I realized was that we were spending more money to pay me for my time to do these things than it would have been if we had just paid through a system that already pre-qualifies your panel and will give you your money back if you have an interview and it didn't go the way that you wanted it. And so my 2 favorites are userinterviews.com and respondent.io. Okay, there's other good options out there, but those are my go-tos. And it makes it super easy. If I want to do research with a particular segment, I can put my study up. I can say how many people I want, define the criteria very tightly, and within 24 hours, I'm going to have a list of contacts and names to get in touch with. That's fantastic. Okay, that's way better than spending weeks trying to recruit people through social media. And that's really important for the product team because we need to move fast. I do not have time to spend a month cultivating, potential, candidates for an interview through social media when I can do it in 24 hours through a paid system. And it's not that expensive, right? It just depends on how long the interview is going to be. And then, you have a dedicated panel. It's fantastic. Okay. So back to this incentivization question. Should we incentivize or not? Yes, 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 yes. Okay, that's my answer for you. All right. For multiple reasons. The most important is that people are giving you their time, which is valuable to all of us. And someone might give you that time for free, or they may want to give you that time once, maybe twice up front because they're excited or they're upset for some reason, but they're not going to keep coming back. Because eventually there's a sunk cost in that effort. Incentivization helps say, hey, look, we're giving you something for your time. It doesn't have to be the same that they might make hourly, but it's just a nice thank you, right? It's also just about relationship building, and so it's very, very important. Now, do you want to give a huge incentive? Now, that's a different discussion. There are some schools of thought that say pay people $1 a minute, and the higher of a rank that person is in the company, the more that number can go up. And that might be true for certain people, especially non-customers. For customers, though, and users of your product, usually it doesn't need to be anything like that, because you're not trying to get people to come to your interviews just because they're trying to make a buck. You're trying to get good feedback out of them, and then you're just rewarding them for their time. And so there's a little bit of a dance there to figure out like what the right incentive is. But you'll have that conversation and figure it out. And then there's a variety of ways that you can enact that. If you use one of the third-party platforms, they'll manage the incentive for you, which is another huge time saver. If you are doing all your recruitment yourself, you can use a dedicated incentive platform. Ribbon is one of those, right? Kind of people get points and then they can go spend those points on a variety of things. Or you can just do Amazon gift cards, right? And just say, I'm gonna do a $25 Amazon gift card for this interview. And that's super easy. But again, someone just has to manage these things internally. Because what you don't want to do is invite people, tell them you're going to give them an incentive, and then they write you a month later and they're like, where's my incentive? They're never coming back. Okay, now I know we're at time, but I want to give some props to Airtime. So I'm going to go a couple minutes over. If you got to go, I understand, but please stick around because Airtime is fantastic for a lot of the things that I've been talking about today. Okay, it's great for collecting feedback and it's great for recruiting people to interviews. Finally, it also can help you analyze the data coming in with its artificial intelligence, which places the feedback into meaningful categories for you. So let's take a quick look under the hood. This is my website. There's my micro survey, right? And mine's very general. I just want to know why people are on my website, right? This is a lead gen for me. If people come to my site and they answer the question, I'll write them back and I'll be like, hey, let's have a conversation and we'll see where things go. Okay. I set this up in 30 minutes and I have 0 coding skills. Okay, what type of surveys can you use in Airtime? Well, it's great because they give you some templates to start from. So if you're a product manager and you're not quite sure what tool to use, think about what you're trying to gather and Airtime will provide a tool for you. Great. Okay, or you can build your own. This is where you look and you can see the survey analysis. Now, I don't have enough information in the survey I was running to actually have an analysis, but what you can see is some pretty important metrics, like how many times the survey was shown, how many responses, the response rate. I could click on text responses and I could actually see the individual responses. I can go over to settings and I can change the attributes of that micro survey. And then if I had enough data in here, it would start putting an analysis of that information right here into the thread. And you can see over here on the left-hand side what Akos was talking about earlier. There's also a video analysis feature in Airtime where if you're doing your calls in Zoom or Gong or something else, you can upload the recordings to Airtime and Airtime's AI will do the same thing for you. And this is a pretty good capability right now, and it's only growing better and better over time. So stay tuned for lots of cool updates. And then finally, I wanted to talk about the recruitment funnel. So when you set up a survey, you're asking a specific question, and then there's always that thank you afterwards. And this is a unique thing that Airtime has done that I think is kind of brilliant, which is that you can use the thank you as a way to book people to interviews. And Airtime has its own booking system. It works very similar to Calendly or Google Scheduler in the sense that you set up your calendar. You can have a link to the calendar. You can embed links to your video recording platform, whether that's Zoom or Teams or something else. And you can basically automate the process so that when someone clicks book a time slot, right, it takes them to a calendar, they can pick a time, and then you're notified of it. And you can see in Airtime all your upcoming bookings and all the ones that you've done. So it makes it really easy to track what's going on both in the past and the future. And the beauty of this is that it's all in one flow, right? There's, Airtime has been doing some research on like, how do you get the highest response rates from these things? And what they found is that if people give a little bit of open text feedback, the likelihood of them showing up for an interview increases significantly. So that's why the call to action for an interview is placed after the micro survey. And if any of you have tried, doing something like the Klaviyo flow that I was showing earlier, what happens is you'll have people say, oh yeah, I'm going to show up to the interviews, right? And then you get like a 50% no-show rate. which is pretty bad. You're wasting a whole bunch of time sitting around, prepping for an interview, sitting there waiting 15 minutes, nobody shows up, emailing them. And that's an hour of paid time that just got wasted and you got no data out of it. And that happens over and over and over again. So it adds up really, really quickly in terms of cost. So what we want to do is we want to try to increase the likelihood that they'll show up. And this methodology, I have a high confidence, really works for that. Okay, so to end today's discussion, where does the product manager fit into this complex system? Well, here is a final infographic for you. I look at CX as a team effort, right? Continuous discovery is something that we're all responsible for. So what you do in the scope of that as a product manager really can be large or small. It's really up to your organization to decide that. You could just be consuming the information and other people are responsible for gathering it and pushing it to you. Or in a democratized effort, you may be responsible for going out and having some of these conversations with the customers and interpreting that information and creating your own insights and sharing that with your team. That's just kind of a cultural decision to be made. Okay. And it also depends on who else you have available to you. If you don't have a CX team, you don't have a researcher, guess what? Customer success and product, it's mostly in your wheelhouse to do this. Sales and support will probably direct information to you if you ask for it, whether through it's something like a Google Chrome extension, or you simply read through their feedback, or you ask them for some kind of monthly report, you can get that from them. But someone has to own it. And then the other big thing is communicating, right? Invest in as much time building internal relationships with other teams. If you do that as much as you invest time in building relationships with your customers, you'll be surprised at how much information there is available to you and how much are people willing to share that with you. It's just creating a win-win by learning to collaborate with each other rather than working in the silos that sometimes we get hired into. Now, if you need help with any of the stuff I've covered today or implementing a system like this, get in touch. That's kind of like what we do at Real Insights. That's one of our big things. Now, I was trying to set aside some time for some stories. We don't have that time today, but if you'd like to connect and you'd like to hear stories of what this might look like at an organization of the size that you're working in, get in touch with me through the Slack channel or email, and I'll be happy to share that with you one-on-one. Okay, so to close today, here's my contact information, and I'd like to do the poll. So if you are interested in a longer masterclass, like a 10 to 12 part masterclass with workshop time and really helping hold your hand, go through and act out many of the things that I teach, please let us know. So you could just say, I'm interested in the chat or in Slack. And what Akash and I will do is we're going to take a look at that. We would love to connect with you to discuss what your specific needs are and your expectations for such a thing. And then we'll deliver on that need. And that brings us to a close. So thank you all so much for listening to me for these last, 8 weeks now. I hope it's been helpful and I hope to be in touch soon.
So while let's give some time for people to respond. If you don't feel like or you haven't made up your mind, you can do it afterwards. We have a Slack channel for all the Academy participants. That's a great place where you can write your wishes and feedback for both of us. And maybe some final notes from my side. And we went over time, so I'm not going to make it long. I'm really grateful to our audience. I see that we have a very loyal audience, people coming back to multiple sessions and being present. I think this is how you make the most out of a masterclass, because you can build on top of the learnings from the previous classes. And Bryan, you've been amazing, and I'm very grateful for you sharing all your experiences. The examples that you showed, those are particularly stand out for me, because that's something that lives very vividly in my mind. So thanks for that. We have a Google Drive where we keep all the learning materials that Bryan posts there for you. It's something that is in the Google Drive, in the Slack.
Group. I will add a couple things for you for this
there, but it's something that I'm going to circulate to everyone afterwards. I also owe you links to the recordings, and I'm sorry to say that, but it's going to be a final a final goodbye now, at least for this masterclass series. But Bryan is around. I'm around. Hopefully, we'll do further things together and further collaborations. And I hope to see all of you either in a webinar or in a future masterclass.
All right. Thank you all again.
Take care, everyone. Ciao, ciao.